Today's webinar, if you haven't already guessed, is about KeyShot's material graph. My name is Will Gibbons, and I'm a trainer for Luxion, the makers of KeyShot, so I do on-site training. And you may have come across some other quick tip videos here and there that I have done as well. Well, today I'll be taking you through the material graph, and hopefully if you're completely new to the subject, there's lots to be learned here, and even if you've already used the material graph before, there should be some cool little nuggets in here for you guys too as well. So I want to mention too that today's webinar will be split into two portions. We're going to start with a presentation, and if you've attended any of our recent webinars, you'll find this format to be familiar already. And then the second half, we're going to do a hands-on demonstration as well, and we'll make sure to get in some Q&A before we wrap everything up as well. Before we actually begin, a few things I want to mention. First off, this presentation is being recorded and will be available afterward for you to watch on youtube.com/KeyShot3D. Also, the slideshow that I'm going to use today is going to be available for you guys to download and reference as well. The KeyShot, the file that I'm going to use during the demo will make that available. And the question that seems to come up time and time again, I think we've already been asked, I will address, is a 2013 Mac Pro. It's an 8-core machine, so 16 threads available, and 16 gigs of RAM. And finally, if you have questions, for those who haven't figured out already, there's a question box that you can type in your question. And we have a couple of Luxion employees on the line who are able to answer those questions while I'm going through the presentation as well. And then again, as mentioned, we will have a Q&A session at the end. So I want to make sure too, everything's all good. So if you guys can hear me, I guess I would have been told by now if you guys can't hear me. I should have asked first, but if there's any issues, go ahead and type those into the chat box as well. All right, again, as mentioned, we are going to be touching on the material graph today. So we'll start with a quick overview of what it is, and then we'll talk about the various moving parts of the material graph and how you actually use them to create the materials that you want. We'll break down everything into two small digestible parts, and then the second half, again, as mentioned, we will go through and I'll get into KeyShot and open this up and show you how to go through and use the various nodes and build your own custom materials in KeyShot. And then we will get to a Q&A. Now, before we can start talking about actually how to use the material graph, we're going to want to know what the heck it is. Again, some of you may be completely new to it. So KeyShot's material graph is a pro feature. It is a node-based visual editor, and when you open the material graph, it opens up in its own window. So it's kind of a separate workspace that allows you to create advanced materials. So anytime that you want to customize a material beyond what you can do in the material properties tab that you're used to working in, the material graph is a great way to do that. Now, before we get into how to actually use the material graph, let's take a look at some examples of advanced materials, or things that I would refer to as advanced materials. This keyboard has a lot of extra imperfections on it, whether it's the skin oils or if they're kind of discoloration or dust or stains or anything like that. The imperfection that's added to these keycaps really sells this image. And this is something that can be done with the assistance of KeyShot's material graph. On the left here, we see a padlock that looks like it may have gotten dropped on the floor of the garage once or twice. It's got some kind of stains on it, some smudges, that type of thing. Really helps to sell that image again. And with multiple bump maps and things, or bump textures and things like that, that's something that you can do using the KeyShot material graph. So we'll get into that. On the right, we have this kind of ancient stone sculpture looking thing, or maybe a very rusted and rugged kind of a metal sculpture. Depends on what you think. But again, the randomness and the variation and the layering of materials done here is something that can be done using KeyShot's material graph. And rather than this helmet just having a solid uniform color and a consistent texture all around, it has various textures and roughnesses and spots and patches of discoloration, again, using the material graph. So outside of making things look aged or damaged or worn or dirty, of course, there are other uses for the material graph. An advanced material could be something just like a composite, like you see here, where it's more of a man-made material in this case we have glass with flakes of metal on top. So a couple layers of metal spots that have different colors to kind of give this appearance of a glittery glass or something like that. Additionally, we can use the material graph to add greater levels of detail and realism, of course. So an image like this that looks a lot less of a rendering, it looks more photoreal, part of that is coming from the fact that there are lots of imperfections, whether it's the roughness of the metal or a few textures that have been added, or the skin oil from somebody's fingers, or maybe it's the patina between the coils on the guitar strings. So in this case, there's a lot going on, and it's all those little details that, again, make this a really impressive image. On this little device, whether it's the surface, either scratches or like a wiping residue, we've got a fading roughness on the back of the device where it looks like it begins as a soft touch material, and it almost looks like it's been rubbed off along the edges where somebody would have held the device a lot. And then of course we have the ground plane that has a lot of cool textures going on and a lot of variation. That's achieved through using KeyShot's material graph. So whether you're actually coming up with a new material for an item, or it's just adding realism to an image, or it's coming up with a ground plane to situate or add some contrast to an image, you can do all those things to really help increase the quality of your renderings by taking advantage of KeyShot's material graph. And that's what we're going to get into how to do today. So how do we actually enter the material graph? Well, in KeyShot's project panel, we have our materials tab, and this is where we get to the material properties. You just double click on a material in your real-time view and it will expose the material tab. And once you're there, you can click on the material graph button, which I've highlighted in yellow here. That's going to launch the separate window, which is the material graph itself. Once we're inside there, we'll see that it's basically built on there are four kind of components to it. We've got a ribbon across the top that has various tools that you can use to work within the material graph. We've got the material properties on the right-hand side, which for all intents and purposes will look just like the material properties that you're used to seeing in the normal KeyShot workspace. Then we have a node library on the left-hand side where you can access things like your material, texture, animation, and utility nodes. And this behaves just like your material library, where you can drag those into the workspace to work on them. Additionally, we have the workspace, which is the gray area between all this. And one other thing that can be mentioned too is that the nodes can be accessed from a right click as well from within the work area. And then here you see this little diffuse node here. That's just that's the material that we have active in here, and nothing else yet. And we'll get into building upon that. So nodes, what are they? How do we use them? Nodes can be thought of as the building blocks of our materials. So a material has a lot of different attributes, different things that make it look a certain way, whether it's a color or a texture or a roughness or a bump. And these in the material graph are represented by nodes. So we have four types of nodes in KeyShot. We have materials, textures, utilities, and animations. And these nodes have various inputs and output channels. So your input channels are going to be on the left side of the node, whereas the output channel will be on the right side of the node. And when you take one node's output and you connect it to another node's input, they start working together. And when you do this, this is how you build materials. Once you've connected a bunch of nodes, you have a bunch of different attributes of one material working together. So we mentioned there are 4 types of nodes. Let's take a look at these. So KeyShot's node library has material nodes, texture nodes, animation nodes, and utility nodes. These can be accessed from the node library, which was on the left-hand side of the material graph, or you can right-click in the work area to access this cascading drop-down menu. And this is my preferred way to work just because it's a little bit faster. So let's look at each one of these node types, beginning with the material node. So when looking at material nodes, probably the simplest way to think about them is layering them. In KeyShot, there may be times when you want to layer materials. This is something that can only be done using KeyShot's material graph. In this very, very basic example, we have metal with a layer of paint on it, and then we've also exposed the underlying metal by using an opacity map. So to make this a little more clear, this is a quick preview of how some of these nodes line up. We have a parent material, which is the bottommost material. That's our metal here. We have a layer of paint on top of it, and it's applied as a label, and we'll get into how this works later again. And then here we can see an opacity map, which is actually an opacity texture that is a procedural texture that we've applied into our opacity channel on our paint material. So that's how you might go about layering materials and then selectively showing the underlying material as well. A couple rules of thumb that I want to mention when it comes to layering materials that you need to keep in mind. First is that opaque materials can be layered on transparent materials. That's absolutely fine. So opaque in this case meaning a material we cannot see through can be layered on top of something you can see through. No problem. However, transparent materials should not and more or less cannot be applied to opaque materials. So don't try to take something like glass or water and try to layer it on top of metal. It's not going to work, okay? So opaque on transparent, good. Transparent on opaque, bad. Also, we've got emissive materials that can be layered on top of other materials as well. Emissive materials layer up just fine, whereas light materials cannot be layered. So anytime you have a light material and you try to put it on top of something or layer it up, it's not going to work, okay? So emissive layered, fine. Light materials do not layer fine. So that's just a bit on material nodes, and we will get into how we use them later in the hands-on portion. Texture nodes, those are the second type of nodes we want to look at. So they can be either image-based or they can be procedural. KeyShot's image-based textures have been around for a long time, and those are found in the material library. So you can just drag those from the texture library into your work area in the material graph, and then you can plug them into other materials. Procedural textures, however, you can grab them from the node library, or you can grab them from the right-click menu within the material graph work area. So again, you might use textures to modify certain attributes of your material. The next type of node we want to talk about are utility nodes. These are completely unique to KeyShot's material graph. You don't use them anywhere else in KeyShot. So we have 6 standard utility nodes, and then we have experimental utility nodes on the right here. Those experimental ones, if you can't access them or if you've never seen them, you need to actually enable experimental features within KeyShot 6 to access them. But today, we are just going to be focusing on these on the left. These are the ones we use all the time. They're very common, and we'll get into how to use them. And now I want to break down each one of these utility nodes even further, okay? So beginning with bump add, this is pretty simple. This is where we take 2 bump textures and we combine them into one. So anytime you've tried to use more than one bump texture on a material, you likely have not been able to unless you've used a material graph. So you do this by adding a bump add node, and we take the output of one bump texture and plug it in, and the output of another bump texture, and we plug it into the input channels, bump 1 and 2, and then we can control how those two behave with each other. For instance, here we have tile normal texture on the left, and then we have scratches procedural texture in the middle, and then we've combined them by using our bump add node on the right. And you can see in an applied example, we might want to take multiple bump maps or bump textures and combine the two into making something look more worn out, more realistic. The next node I want to look at is color adjust. And this one allows us to make global changes to a texture. So if we have, in this case, say a camouflage, and we plug it into the color channel of color adjust, when we get into the color adjust node's properties, we can manipulate the color of this texture using the color adjust node. This could be useful if you need to change like the colors of a logo or a texture on the fly without getting into Photoshop. So here's the example of taking that camouflage procedural texture and then applying the color adjust node and then desaturating it completely. So we remove all the color from it. And this applied to kind of a real life scheme here. In order to create this galvanized material on this metal bucket, that camouflage procedural texture was used, and then the color adjust node was used to pull the color out of it and then kind of tweak it to make it appropriate for this material. The next one we have here is color composite. So similar to us using the bump add node to combine bump textures, in this case we can combine multiple textures of any kind. In this case, we get the added benefit of blending and alpha masks if we want to do that. So like in Photoshop, when you have your layer 1 and then you have a background layer behind it, you can control how those two items, one on each layer, behave with one another just by toggling your blending modes. Well, we have access to pretty much all of those as well in here within KeyShot using our color composite node. And for those of you who wish to download this presentation after the fact, you can follow this link here that will put you on the Wikipedia page to learn more about blending modes and how they actually work. So again, you apply each of these textures and they behave as if they're on their own layer, and then you can control how they interact with one another. For instance, here we have an occlusion procedural texture on this statue, and you can see the local coloring, the darker colors in certain areas. And we also used a curvature procedural to do a similar thing on the sculpture, but in this case, that shading actually comes, it shows up in areas based upon the underlying curvature of the of the geometry. So where there's negative or zero curvature, there's a little bit of discoloration here. Then taking both of those and combining them using a color composite node, and I think they were set to a blending mode of multiply, we were able to kind of average these out and then get them dialed into what you see here. And this was essentially used as the color of the final material. So here you can see it applied to this translucent material, and it gives us the appearance of a very pure marble, an old marble sculpture, and you can see the discoloration in certain areas. So that's a lot more interesting and realistic than having a solid colored cream or white sculpture here. So that's color composite. The next one here is really simple. This is called color invert. It does just like it sounds by taking your texture and completely inverting it, so your black values would become white and white values would become black. And this will work on colors as well. And in this case, this is just a grayscale example. But when you take your texture and you plug it into your color invert source, the node will send the inverted color information out of the color invert output. So this illustrated here, we have our tile texture from the KeyShot library. And in this case, I wanted to use it, and I wanted the grout, the stuff in between the tiles, to actually be white, not black. So I just used the color invert node. It was a quick one-step process. And then you can see it here actually as a material in KeyShot. So again, nice to be able to invert something on the fly without having to leave KeyShot, get over to Photoshop, and then re-import your textures. The next utility node we're talking about here is the color key mask, and this one's a little bit different. This took me a little while to understand at first. So what we're going to do here is explain what's going on here. So with the color key mask, we're able to choose a color to then turn into a mask, which will then mask out the material that it's applied to. So in this case, we have a texture that's plugged into the color channel of our metal. So we have a metal material with this texture on it, and the color key mask is pulling from the same source. And with that color key mask, I actually selected the white pixels of this texture. And then we plugged it into the opacity of the material it was applied to, meaning that anything that was white on this label or this texture made this material disappear in that area. So the breakdown here looks like this. We have a texture that has, it's an image texture, of course, that has white with 3 stripes inside it, orange, yellow, and red. And then the color key mask was applied and white was selected. So black, the white area becomes black. This is the mask. So KeyShot sees this now as a mask, and then it removes, or it makes it invisible, the white areas on either side of the 3 stripes. So there are the 3 stripes as a metal material with a little bump texture on them, and that white area is completely out of sight. So it's a cool way to use a node to edit your textures, again, without having to go into Photoshop and make multiple textures to use in KeyShot. So the way this was used all together was that same image texture was used as a paper label in the bottom, like underneath everything, and then there was a foil label on top with the 3 stripes, just with the white area masked out using the color key mask node. And before I get into the last utility node that we're going to talk about today, there's a concept that we need to understand fully. And this, again, can be one of the challenging ones if you're completely new to this. So I'll try to make this clear. We're used to specifying something like, we're used to specifying numbers or values by numbers, like 1 or 2 or 0.5, and that's fine. But in some cases in KeyShot, when we are using things like textures or texture maps or images to drive a value, it's going to rely on the actual grayscale value within that texture. So anytime you choose a color, there's going to be a certain amount of white, whether it's 0% or 100% or something in between. And there's actually a correlation between that grayscale value and numerical values. So in this case, we have 0% white, it is black, and that correlates to the numerical value of 0. 100% white, or pure white, is going to correlate to the numerical value of 1. And then, of course, anywhere in between, we have, many steps, a full gradient. But the point is that in a lot of cases, we can use values, actual amount of white, and we can use that to drive a value of an attribute within a material. So the takeaway here, and what can help you, is just remembering and assimilating that black equals 0 and white equals 1. So black equals 0, white equals 1. And to build on that concept, we have the last utility node I'm going to talk about today, and it's a color to number. And what this does is it takes our value ranges, so our grayscale value ranges, and converts them into numerical values. actual like numbers. And then the benefit of that is we can make fine-tuned adjustments based on a number scale, and we can also plug that into a channel of a texture or a material to then drive that parameter. And in this case, we have an illustration of this. So on the very left-hand side, we have a piece of glass, and we've got this procedural texture on it as a bump texture. But in this case, what we wanted to do was fade from completely smooth glass to one with a bump texture. So we went ahead and applied a color gradient procedural texture to it, and that was plugged into the bump height. And what that effectively says is use this cellular procedural texture as the actual shape, use this gradient as the value of bump height. Meaning, again, black equals 0, white equals 1. So we're going to fade from 0 bump height to a bump height of 1. Well, we didn't want it to go all the way to 1 because oftentimes in KeyShot, that's too aggressive. So what we did then, too, is we plugged in a color to number utility node, and that allowed us to then fine-tune these values. So if we wanted this to go to from a bump height of 0 all the way to a bump height of 0.5, we can simply type that into the color to number node, and it will adjust our gradient to reflect those values. And then the net effect is that we are fading, if we were to overlay these, we are essentially fading from completely smooth to a bump height of 0.5 using this texture. So in this slide here, we can see this piece of glass has no bump at the top, and it slowly starts to fade, and then as it gets toward the bottom, we have that cellular bump texture that's fading to about a 50% bump height, or a 0.5. All right, now I mentioned we were done with the utility nodes. We have a couple other nodes here, and these are animation nodes I want to just talk about real quick. So this first one is called color fade. And what this will do is it will allow us to transition from one color to another, or through multiple colors. And if we want to show something like different color combinations, or if we wanted to see different finishes on a product, we could do that using this animation node. So when you apply this, you end up getting an animation in your animation timeline that when you play through will fade between all these colors. So this is technically a material animation. So here, if this was our starting point with a chair with a kind of transparent plastic, I will show you real quick what we can do with the color fade. So here we are starting with white, and we are fading from black to orange, then to red, and then back to white again. And so that was done by choosing those 4 colors in our color fade and then applying it to the color channel of this material. So pretty simple. The other one I want to talk about, this is the only other one we have at this moment for KeyShot 6, and this is a number fade. So just like we fade between colors with the color fade, we can do the same thing with numerical values using our number fade. And this is anytime you need a number to specify something, like you wouldn't specify the location or the scale of a texture or a bump height with a color, right? You wouldn't say like, I want it to be red height. You know, that wouldn't make as much sense. So we can use our number fade, and we can just choose a number that we want it to start at and end at. And in this case, using the same example, I wanted to take this chair and I wanted to fade it from top to bottom and then have it come back. So I'll show you what that looks like here. Oopsies, sorry. Here we go. So from the top, it fades down and then it fades back up. So the way this was done using a number fade was I started with the opacity texture on top of the chair, and I faded using the number as a location. I faded it down to a lower location on the chair. So quite simple. And since I spoiled the surprise next slide, we now know we are going to move on to our hands-on portion, in which I will open up a file with KeyShot, and we will start to talk about how to recreate all these things that I showed you. All right. So launching KeyShot 6 right here. And I have to thank Nate Duxbury, Ahmed El-Gendi, and Caitlin Boone for providing this cool heavy-duty stapler model that we'll be using today. All right, a couple things, just so you know how I set this up. I did this just to save us some time. So I'm going to show you the environment we're using is the KeyShot 3 panels, the 3 panels side, I think it's called side panels. And then I'm just going to throw that on a white background to make it less distracting. And the other thing that I did real quick was I just made scene sets for a bunch of the different nodes that I wanted to illustrate or show you how that worked. So when I was done with one example, we could just move on to the next one. So starting with layering materials. Let's say that we have our kind of a unpainted metal here, and we want to actually put a layer of paint on top of this. Well, the first thing I would do is double click on the material I want to, in this case, it's this rough metal, and I'm going to click our material graph. And now we are looking at the material graph. As mentioned before, we have our single node, which is the metal that we have applied to our stapler. We have that ribbon on top that I had mentioned. We have material properties on the right. Here's our window. And if we were to hit our M, we can bring up our materials and textures, and this is going to be that node library that we can pull from. Okay? So let's say I want to apply this paint on top of our metal. I can start by just dragging this into the work area. So I have this now I have 2 nodes. I can take the output of my paint node and I can plug it into my metal node. If I let go, it's automatically added as a label. It's a layered label. And at this point, this is a label that is enveloping the entire metal material. So it's completely coated in paint. Now let's say we wanted to show some of that underlying metal. Well, just like we did in the presentation, we could apply a texture that would then show the metal underneath. In this case, spots is a great example to use. It's a nice high contrast texture. So if I take its output and I plug it into the opacity channel on paint, because opacity controls how see-through or how visible something is, we plug it in and we actually don't see a change at first. Well, there's a cool tool built into our material graph called Color Preview, and if you hover up to our toolbar, we can see it's preview color. We can also, while that node is selected, click or press C on our keyboard to get the color preview. And what this is showing is mostly white. Well, that tells me that we're probably scaled up a little too big. So I can double click on this node to access its properties, and I can scale it down. I can increase the levels if I want, and maybe the density. And obviously now we're starting to see quite a few spots. So we're in a good spot there. If I hit X on the keyboard, we're going to see the result. Let's go back to that color preview real quick just to break this down. Remember we talked about value. Well, black being 0 and white being 1, in this case, since we're plugged into opacity, we have black 0, 1, or set to opacity. So our opacity is 0 where the spots are, and it is 1 where the white is. So we are essentially able to see the metal material because the paint is 0% opaque wherever the black spots are. So pretty simple. And what's nice is there's a little shortcut with this texture. Some of our procedural textures, we can invert them on the fly. We could also adjust our inside and outside colors. So that's one example of how you might layer up a material and then show the underlying material as well. The next thing I want to show you is our bump add node. So if we move on over to this example, we can go ahead and double click the material we want to edit, get back into our material graph, and here's our paint. Okay, let's say we want to add a texture to this. I can simply right click and go to my textures, and choose something like a noise texture and plug this into our bump. So we see really quickly the effect that this takes on our stapler. Let's say we wanted to add another texture, in this case an image-based texture, not a procedural. I can drag into my work area from my library, and if I want to plug this guy in, well, I can't have both of them going into the paint. So as we previously mentioned, we want to use a utility called a bump add. So when I now have a bump add, I can go ahead and plug both of my textures into the bump add and take the bump adds output and put it into the bump channel of the paint material. So now we have a combination of these two, and in this case the crackle is way too aggressive. So one thing I can do is I could double click on this texture, and I could take my bump height and scale it back a little bit. Another thing I could do is double click on my bump add node, and you notice we have a ratio slider and we have a weight 1 and a weight 2. These allow us to increase or decrease the amount of influence that each of these textures has on the overall appearance. So I could go back to my noise texture, maybe scale it down, maybe give it some more of a bump height. So using the bump add node, we can really dial in and come up with some interesting combinations using multiple bump textures on a single material. The next example I want to look at is a color adjust node. So here, if we were to open up our material graph for this material, again, starting with a plain paint, we can access our textures, and in this case, just like in my previous example, if we had a camouflage and we plugged it into color, we see all sorts of green splotches on our stapler. And the reason I wanted to use this is there's a lot of different colors in here and some good contrast. Well, if we wanted to make edits to this without really adjusting the texture, we can grab a color adjust node, and we can interrupt the connection between the camouflage and the paint. And by taking our color adjust node and increasing some saturation, we can take then our hue slider and move this around, and we can see global effects on the color of that texture. And what's cool is this is also non-destructive editing as well, so we're not actually messing with the original settings of this camouflage. So it's a nice flexible way to make adjustments, and we can, play with like our value and our contrast, or we can take our saturation down. And of course, it doesn't just work on procedurals, but if we had, let's say we have, a texture, an image-based texture, we could do the exact same thing where we plug that into our color adjust. And if I set this back to its default, so I have value of 1, saturation of 1, here and here. So this is the original, but of course I could then take this and mess with the hue and have all sorts of colors of wood and play around with ideas without having to go into Photoshop and make edits to that texture. So there's a lot of flexibility we can get out of a color adjust. Next thing I'd like to show you real quick is the color composite. So following our previous examples, if we double click a material we want to edit and bust open the material graph, we then have our plain paint. But let's talk about color composite. So we're mentioning that it gives you kind of that Photoshop style blending. Well, if I take a image-based texture, drag this guy in, and apply it to the color of the paint, we see that it's now appearing, or we have our texture that is now covering and influencing the color of our paint material. Well, let's say we wanted to add something on top of this, like let's say, I don't know, a color gradient. We could then take this guy and, well, we need to be able to combine them. So let's go to Utilities, grab our color composite. We'll take our first texture and plug it into the source. That's our layer 1. We'll plug in our color gradient to our background, and we'll take this into the paint. And we don't see any effects yet. But if we go into our color composite node, we can then adjust our blend mode. Currently at normal, we don't see these two interacting because it's just one on top of the other. But if I go to multiply, we can now start to see the effects of this. I can then go into my color gradient, and let's say I want to change this to a different color. So we'll do green and red, and then we had something like a view direction, something crazy. And then at this point, we can go into our color composite, and we can then affect how, or we can control, again, like our bump 1, bump 2, we can control how much of each of these have an effect on the overall appearance, which is pretty cool. Moving on to our color to number. This is the example where we essentially took our values and our grayscale values and converted them into numerical values. And in this example, real quick, I'm just going to isolate one of these parts, make this a little easier to see. And I think I'll change this to black so we have some nice high contrast surfaces. So let's get into this material, and we have our paint. If we were to start with just taking one of these textures, an image-based texture say, and we applied it as a roughness texture, we see, or we can sort of see the effects where we have some glossy and some rough areas, but that's pretty tough to see. So if we were to color preview this, it's C on the keyboard again. Now remember, with our values, dark or black being 0, white being 1, we are saying that the roughness of this material is 0 in the black spots and 1 in the white spots, meaning it's mostly too rough to see what's going on there. So what I'm going to do is grab our color to number, and I'm going to plug this in here and take this guy into here. And then we want to be previewing the effects of the color to number, not the original texture. So I'm going to click color to number, and I will hit C on the keyboard to preview it. So nothing has changed quite yet, but if we double click color to number, we have input and output. So our input is going to affect what is coming from this texture, what values, and our output is going to affect what is going into our roughness. I want to start just by playing with the output. And if I see we have 0 and 1, again, black and white, if I take that white value and I take that output down, we make it less and less white. So we're bringing the roughness to a lower and lower number. And in this case, that should give us a more glossy finish overall. So if I hit X to see the effects of this, now we can start to see the differentiation because we have a surface that's not too diffused. So if we bring this down even further, well, we can take it all the way down and it's completely glossy. If we bring it up a little bit, we can have just some spot roughness. Now this looks weird because you wouldn't have areas that look like scratches that are selectively glossy. It would actually be the opposite. A nice little trick we can do here is we can use this to invert the value as well. So for instance, if I made this 1 and 0 respectively, now we've inverted the whole thing. And you can see that if we color preview, the areas that were black are now white and vice versa. And if we wanted to then make the white areas not quite so rough, again, we would then just take a value and reduce it till it backs off even further. And finally, before I move on from this, just to explain this, if we wanted to affect this texture, because we can't actually access, since this is not a procedural texture, we can't get in and start making changes to the amount of white and black in there. Well, we can do that using this still by just changing these values here. So again, if we were to color preview this, I can choke back some of these, some of the white, so we have overall less of it, and then we can close out of there, and then we really, get this kind of natural, kind of roughed up finish. So there's lots that you can do with color to number. That's just one example, of course, but it becomes a very powerful node that gives you lots of control over your different material nodes. Well, all of your nodes essentially, and then of course, an example that was talked about earlier briefly, just to show you how it works real quick. We have our color invert pretty simply if we just took a texture and let's say we had a lovely wooden stapler and we applied this as the color. In our material graph, we have just the texture applying or affecting the color channel of the paint. We can go ahead and we can just do a quick color invert. And if we were to interrupt this, we can see that from instead of a reddish texture, we have now kind of a bluish texture. So regardless of what you're using, this color invert is literally just going to find the opposite of it and output that into whatever you've plugged it in. So that's a quick rundown, and I know I didn't show the color key mask. If there's a lot of interest for that, I definitely could show an example of that. But I also see questions starting to build up that I haven't had a chance to look at. So at this point, that is kind of a whirlwind run through of what the material graph is, what the nodes are, how they can be used, and then a quick little demonstration of how those can be put together in real time. So now I'm wondering if we want to take a brief moment to address some of the questions that are popping up. The question is, can we add more than one bump add node? And the answer is yes. Let's go ahead and do that real quick. So if I'm going to go ahead and put a bump add utility node in here, as we did before, I'm also going to duplicate this. So now we have two of them. I'll plug this into the next bump channel. And let's go ahead and grab some textures. So we'll start off with something like noise fractal. Let's plug this into one of them. And let's go ahead and grab another texture, say a scratches texture. We'll plug this into bump 1. And we'll grab finally, let's just do an image-based texture, why not? And we'll grab something fairly high contrast here. And we will plug this guy in over here. Sorry for backing out. So I'm going to go ahead and disable the color here just to make this easier to see. We'll make this black. Sometimes it's easier to see with the high contrast material in color. So now, again, the trick I mentioned before, once you start getting busy here with a lot of different nodes, is finding out what is causing what appearance or what effect. So for instance, if I click on one node and I hit C on the keyboard, we have a color preview of what it is. Let me go ahead and scale this guy down a little bit. And then I'll get out of that. Let's see what's happening here with scratches. Okay, they are really big, so let's actually scale those guys down. Maybe we'll increase the levels, why not? There we go. And let's take a preview on this guy. Okay, we cannot preview that one because it is an image-based texture, so what I'm going to do is just scale this down a little bit and cut the bump height because it's pretty aggressive right there. So then overall, of course, we can still go and use our bump weight 1 and weight 2 and continually build upon this as needed. There is technically no limit to what you can do with it.
Can you just quickly go over the tools on the ribbon there?
The toolbar or the ribbon up top that has the various tools that you can use inside the material graph. On the upper left-hand corner, we have the option to save our material to our library. We can then also add it. We can add our material nodes or our texture nodes, our animation nodes, or our utility nodes here, the same as you would by right-clicking. We also have the option to duplicate the nodes. Again, we did that by right-clicking earlier, but we can do it up here. We can delete them with the trash can here, or we can just right-click and delete. We have our three previews, which is our color preview, alpha preview, and bump preview. And then we have this nice button here just to demonstrate that guy. If I have made a mess of things, let's say we're all zoomed in here and I've been moving things around and it gets out of control, this button will clean it up, and then this button will center it to my window as well. And then this will scale everything to fit my material graph work area depending on how it's set up. So again, if you're not sure where to do something, you can find them up in the top in the ribbon, or you can also right click to access most of those items as well.
Cool. Something else in the right-click menu that somebody was asking about was disable selection. So is it possible to disable a node without disconnecting it, is what they were asking.
Good question. So if you don't want to disconnect a node, there's always the option to disable it. So let's say the second set of bump textures we've added we don't want on at this point. Again, I'm going to pull this off. We can right click and do the disable, which again now is giving us only the effects of this noise fractal into our paint texture right here. And this is again just a nice way to, especially when things get a little bit more complex, you can kind of treat your material nodes or all the various nodes in your material kind of as groups or chunks, and you can disable and enable certain amounts of them. That is a pretty quick way to see the overall effect of those.
Cool. Another really good question that came up, which is something I see pretty often, is can you add, going back to the example of, say, the layered paint material on top of the metal, is there a way to add a bump map to that paint material so that it looks like those spots maybe are drips of paint or something like that?
Yeah, great question. So of course, if you were to be doing this and you wanted this to look like metal with paint dripped on it, you would want to be able to incorporate some sort of bump texture as well. Well, I will show you how to do that using these same nodes that exist in here. So one thing that the first thing we'll want to do is make sure that we don't look like we have drips of metal on top of paint, but vice versa. So we'll go into our spots and we will take our values and we will swap them out. So now it looks like we've got paint splattered on top of our metal. We can of course go in and play with the distortion and a few of our other parameters here to kind of dial those in. Once we're happy with the shape, we now need to use this as a bump on our paint. So if we were to take this and plug it right into paint, we start to see the effect of catching some light on the edge of that material. The last thing I might suggest though is if you wanted to have this kind of domed effect, is we could go ahead and increase the fall off. However, you'll notice that this makes the actual opacity of them disappear. So in this case, you wouldn't want to take the same node and plug it in. What we would do is back this guy off, and we would duplicate this node, disconnect this from bump, connect this from bump, double click it, make sure we've unchecked sync so it doesn't affect the other one. And at this point, we can take this guy and increase the fall off, and it should, that's a little bit aggressive. So if we back off on that, we should see a bit more of kind of a domed effect. And depending on what our bump height is set to and everything like that, we can really adjust the overall appearance of this.
Awesome. I think this same kind of topic could be gone over again, maybe with a traditional texture map, maybe just the KeyShot logo from the library, because I think most users out there are actually using the traditional maps. And we did get another question of like a gold foil label on a wine bottle, for example, kind of like the example you showed with the red, yellow, and orange stripes, and then the X on top. I think it could be a benefit to go over that just once more again.
Yeah, so I can tie those two together. The question is, what about this whole idea of layering materials in a practical sense? You may want to have materials with different finishes on top of one another. So the first thing is understanding exactly how labels work. So if I actually close this, I'm going to delete these. So we're back to our metal here. And I'm actually just going to apply glossy red paint. Let's start from here. So if we were to take an image-based texture like a logo, let's say I apply this directly to my part and I scale it down and I move it over. And sometimes it looks like we lost our shadows there. Let's see if I can fix that real quick. Okay. All right. So here we are with our label. Let's check what this looks like in our material graph. We see we have our red paint, that's the base layer. We have a layer of plastic covering our red paint if I disconnect our texture. Now when I reconnect our texture to the diffuse channel, two things are happening. The color of this plastic material is being pulled or driven by this image texture. So our red, our white, and our blue. I'm sorry, black, white, and blue. And the other thing is the transparency of the PNG, the transparent pixels outside of the circle, are effectively masking out the rest of that plastic that would normally be covering our stapler. So now that we've done that, we can go ahead and now that we realize, well, this plastic is effectively the material of our label. So let's go ahead and change that, which by double clicking in here, we can go to our material type and we can change it to metal. So at this point, we now have kind of a metal label on top of our glossy paint. That's the first step. The next thing that I might do is, let's say we did want to use this to get some sort of bump. Well, we could not do it that way. One thing that we could do is go ahead and see if we can, is this gonna ruin me? There we go. So we can go into here, duplicate this texture, and we can go ahead and take our bump height back down so it's not quite so aggressive. So here it looks like we have kind of a badge that's stuck onto here with some sort of depth. And then of course, if we wanted to vary the texture or the surface, kind of like you would with a wine bottle label, that is actually the bump of the surface here. So if we wanted to add an additional bump, like a noise bump, go ahead and grab that texture. And what we would want to do is plug this in here, but we need to add a utility to get our bump add. Let's plug this guy in here, plug this in here, and take our noise texture and plug it into bump 2. And if we preview it, oops, let's preview our bump add. Can't do that. Have I done something wrong, Rex? I might have backed myself into a corner here. But yeah, so at this point, of course, one thing we can do, first off, just to show this, we can add some roughness to that material. So those two materials are now separate to one another. I'm trying to think.
Is it just the scale of the noise texture?
Maybe it's just way too big. Let's see. Yep, you called it. Yep, and so now if I increase that, we start to see. So this was, yeah, that's the other great, that's the great reason or the great benefit of having access to the color preview, like I mentioned, with where you can click this button up top here or hit C on your keyboard to check your scale. So if you get stuck like I did for a minute there and you're not sure what to do, that's a great option. Make sure you're not scaled up too large or too small. So does this tackle that kind of two-step question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this might be a good opportunity to just show the color key mask, perhaps mask out the blue in the logo and show people how you can do that with the color key mask utility.
Sure, why not? So let's say we wanted to mask out part of this logo. And in this case, I think I'll go for trying to mask out the blue. That's when we would use the color key mask. That's a utility that we talked about earlier. And in this case, we would grab the color from this texture, plug it into the source, grab our color key mask, and plug it into the opacity of the metal. And the whole thing kind of goes semi-transparent. That's because by default, our color key is set to red to begin with. And this is what we want to actually use to make a color selection. So I'll start by going ahead, taking my color picker, and I'll actually just within our work area here choose the blue I want to mask out, okay? And the next thing we're going to do, if I go ahead and hit invert, it's actually going to mask out or get rid of that color that I've now selected. The last thing, if you notice, it still isn't behaving properly. Well, we have two parameters here. The first one is threshold. This top one is going to determine how much of the color you've chosen needs to be, like how close of a match you have to have before it masks it out. So if this was a solid color, I could go up to 1 and it'd be perfect. But in this case, there's actually a gradient in there, so that we may be subjective to having to feather this a little bit. And the fuzziness, of course, is kind of the opposite relationship. So if I decrease that, I bring it down, it's going to reduce the amount of other colors that it masks out with it. So if we put these on opposite ends of the spectrum, if you're just trying to knock out one color or one solid color, you're going to want this one set to 1, this one set to 0. You choose the color you want to knock out, and you hit the invert, and at that point you're there.